Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. If you are a fan of the Global Missions Podcast, would you please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app? This will help others find this show and benefit from the podcast. Over the years, the Global Missions Podcast has released several episodes that highlight certain geographical areas of the world. We've highlighted Latin America, for example, and Central Asia. Today, we're going to turn our attention to the continent of Europe, and we'll be exploring some of the ways God is at work in Europe and the opportunities for churches around the world to be involved. Our guest today is Jon Burns, who serves as the president and CEO of Greater Europe Mission, sometimes called GEM. Jon has been a pastor and a church planter, and he's held key positions in several other Christian agencies, actually, including Youth for Christ and More Than Gold. He also founded a Lions Raw movement, which recruits football fans, or in North America, we often call this soccer, these fans to help needy communities and disadvantaged children. It's a really interesting angle, Jon, and you said that you actually were honored by Queen Elizabeth for this work, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah, a few years ago, I got an award from the Queen, had to go to the palace and get a medal like I was some war hero, which I'm obviously not.
Pretty special, though. Pretty special.
Oh, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Jon took up his current role with Greater Europe Mission in 2016. And Jon, we want to say welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Mags.
Well, this is one of those episodes where we are going to not only take a topic, but really we're going to angle in on a geography. Jon's experience is particularly in Europe, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We know from his biography that he's got rich ministry experience. Jon, just as we get to know you a little bit at the beginning of this conversation, tell us a bit about your call to serve in ministry.
Well, I became a Christian when I was 17 through a Billy Graham mission in the northeast of England in a soccer stadium. And then a year later, I was attending the famous Keswick Convention. And they have a missionary meeting on the Wednesday. You try and avoid it in case you get called to Africa. And the Lord called me, and I responded to him and said, whatever you want me to do, wherever you want me to go, I'm all yours. And it became quite clear that I didn't need to wait for some full-time ministry moment. And within months, I'd been asked to help lead in a boys' brigade, a young boys' outreach group. And so kind of getting my feet wet in mission started straight away, reaching out to local kids in the neighborhood where I lived. And really, it's kind of just evolved from there. I spent a lot of time in youth ministry, mostly in the UK, and then a little bit globally, helping the Youth for Christ movement. And then got involved in church planting in both London and the northeast of England, and got asked to do a lot of work across Europe with church planting, as I still do in my new job. And then obviously a few years ago, got asked if I'd become the president of Greater Europe Mission, which kind of brought all this journey together for me, in that, you know, I'm passionate about Europe, as we'll explore, I guess, in the next 20 minutes or so. But I'm also passionate that lost people find Jesus wherever they are, and the kind of natural ways that we should engage in that. So yeah, that's kind of who I am, my passion for the lost. I have a bias for the young, and I have a bias for men's ministry, but I'm just desperate that the lost meet Jesus.
That's a great introduction. You're serving now, in principle, with Greater Europe Mission, GEM, as we often call it. Tell us just a little bit about the ministry of GEM.
So it's 70 years old, actually, this year. It was founded by a military chaplain who landed on the beaches of Europe on the back of the Second World War, thought he'd gone to minister to the American troops, but after an accident he had, found himself in hospital and realized how desperately lost Europe was on the back of two world wars, literally ripped the soul out of Europe. And so a calling started to develop in him, Bob Evans. He went back to Wheaton College, and with all that gang, Billy Graham and all the rest of them, Troutman and the rest, and really got a call to start leading discipleship movements in Europe. And he worked for Billy Graham for a while and then was sent out to Europe. And for 70 years, we've been equipping Europeans to reach Europeans. We've been running Bible colleges, and probably in the last 20 years, an increasing focus on church planting and equipping church planters. So we have various ministries, all kinds of, ministries with youth camps and Bible colleges and music ministry and an online ministry. But at our heart, we're crazy about discipleship multiplication. How do we disciple people and teach people to disciple people that will disciple others? And how does church planning play a key part in that? So that's who we are.
It's a good introduction. Thanks. When we think of Europe historically, many may think of it as a largely Christian part of the world, the Western world. Why is Europe important in these days? And just tell us about the state of Europe as per the gospel.
And I think the problem is, as tourists, we see all these beautiful cathedrals, right? And so we assume that at some time people were very committed to their faith and were putting their money where their mouth was and their time and building these wonderful cathedrals. Obviously, it's the history of so many missionary movements, hundreds of years ago. But as I hinted at earlier, really since the Second World War, the church in Europe has been in mass decline. And I argue with anybody that Europe is the most unreached place on the planet right now. And so, I was just in Athens with someone the other week, and they were telling me that 0.2% of the college students around them were evangelical Christians, 0.2%. And that was 60,000 students in the biggest university in Athens. So, that's not just an unreached people group, that's seriously unreached people group. We think there's only, if an unreached people group is defined as less than 5% evangelical Christian, which we could debate, but if that's what we define it as, there's only really one little bit of Romania that's reached. There's about 8%.
Wow, and we wouldn't think of Romania either.
No, I know. There's a little bit of Transylvania that's 8% evangelical, but really the rest of Europe is nowhere near that. In France, they just recently celebrated moving the needle over 20 years from half of 1% to 1% evangelical. And they celebrated, as they should. That's almost revival, but it's still 1%. 1% of the French are evangelical Christians. So it is the darkest continent in the sense of Christian mission.
Interesting. And we could maybe say that it's post-Christian then. I've heard that term used, that it was where Christianity, or formerly Christianity, was strong there. And now you say it's come a low ebb.
Yeah, and obviously, we stumble across loads of Catholic churches and some of them are filled with believing Catholics who have experienced the Lord and been renewed in their faith. But even the mass percentage of Catholics, not many of them we would describe as evangelical Christians. And so there are, big churches still with lots of numbers attached to them, but believing Christians, it's a very, very small number.
Well, we clearly hear that Europe is one of the unreached areas of the world and needs the Lord. There are millions of people there. Why is it important now? Why is it at this particular time that you are such an advocate for reaching Europe?
I think moments of crisis are always moments of opportunity for the Holy Spirit. And the end of the Second World War was a crisis. It was a crisis in Europe. It's when, GEM and other places really pushed into Europe to start reaching again. There was the opportunity when the Berlin Wall came down, and obviously the whole push, the co-mission push to Eastern Europe at the end of the 80s. And then you look at kind of European crisis the last few years. So you look at, the economic crisis, you look at Brexit, which I'd rather we didn't talk about. You look at the immigrant crisis, and all of these things conspire so that the normal humanist foundations of Europe have been absolutely cracked for people, for atheists included. And at the same time, you have this mass migration from the 1040 window, as we call it, from the Middle East and North Africa. And so suddenly you've got masses of Muslims, and lots of them nominal Muslims, running away from fundamentalism, coming into Europe. And so the opportunity right now for the gospel is, I think, the greatest in my lifetime for Europe.
It does seem like a bit of a perfect storm in some respects, because the trends of the European cultures themselves, if we could call that internal to Europe, those issues going on. And then, like you said, these external factors of new Europeans transiting. So interesting that you see it that way. I think the Apostle Paul did too. Crisis led to opportunity, right?
Well, it always is, every crisis is an opportunity for the Holy Spirit, because he redeems, right? That's what the Lord does. He's a redeemer. And we see redemption opportunities all over the place, and we're hearing redemption stories every day. And I've got missionaries serving with me who've been on the mission field for 30, 40 years, and they're telling me we've never seen anything like the last 2 years. I wouldn't dare call it revival. That's what I pray for, and that's what I push for. And it's not revival yet, but we are seeing masses of people come to faith, lots of Muslims, lots of non-Muslims as well. And we're seeing opportunities and responses that lots of our missionaries have only ever dreamt of.
Well, take us to some of those places if you can, or at least the stories. What are some of the ways that you do see that God is at work in Europe?
It's very difficult not to talk about the refugee crisis. And I would hate for people to think we're just a Muslim outreach ministry. We're not. But I can't not talk about that, because that's what, you join in what you see the Father doing, right? And we see the Father doing crazy things with Muslims. And so our main gateway, and actually the main gateway for lots of migrants, is Lesbos Island in Greece. And it's, 15 miles off the coast of Turkey. You'll have seen the images of kids washed up on the beaches and all the life jackets and the rubber rafts. And there's a camp there called Moria Camp, and it was built for 1,500 people. As of today, there's 14,500 people trapped in that camp. We've sent teams upon teams to serve, loads of Canadian teams and US teams and teams from across Europe. And we're seeing not only that as we try and be the hands and feet of Jesus and serve people when they're at their point of absolute need, but we're also seeing an openness and a response. I can't give you exact places and names because that would be wrong, but we're seeing ridiculous response there. And in other places as well that have been either gateways or destination ministries. We talk about Frankfurt a lot because Frankfurt has been a city that's had huge immigration over 3 different waves over 25 years. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a church planting movement called Mosaic just start to realize that the Germans have an opportunity to reach both migrants and Germans together. Bonhoeffer's dream, really, it was. And so we've got a guy there who's on his 10th church plant in 9 years. And you go to these churches, it's like the United Nations. There's headphones and there's little booths at the back, and 7 or 8 languages used in a congregation of 100 people. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And so I could point to a location where they've seen 95 Muslims baptized in a year and 100 salvations so far this year, and they've planted 5 churches with new converts, and one of those churches is already a second generation plant within 12 months. Well, that's the stuff we only ever dream of, right? And particularly in Europe. And, I know we see it in India and we've seen it in China, but in Europe, it's like, this is wonderful days for us.
Yeah, pretty special. And we want to acknowledge that, God in his sovereignty is doing different things in different seasons in different places. But I wonder, do you see the Lord at work particularly among newer Europeans as opposed to the, I call classical Europeans, the native Germans, the native French, the native Spaniard?
Yeah, we do. And so, I worked in London around the Olympics. That was the More Than Gold thing. And, I think I worked with 3,000 churches in this More Than Gold thing. And what was interesting to us was immigrant churches were the fastest growing churches, whether that was Iranians or whether that was Nigerians, the Church of the Redeemer's on fire in Europe. And even actually whether it was Eastern Europeans in Catholic churches that had been dead for years, and suddenly this new generation was finding hope and community in the old Catholic churches. So immigrant churches are growing hugely. But I think I'm even more excited that traditional churches are growing with immigrants. So the church I was sent out from, Stockton Baptist Tabernacle in the northeast of England. And when I was sent out to mission, there was one flag on the wall, and it was an English flag. You go now and there's 30 flags on the wall. I was there on Easter Sunday, and they baptized 3 Iranians and 2 Afghanis into a church that was all white and is now 50% non-white. And that just thrills me, absolutely thrills me.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful story of, like you said, the broadening of that base. Well, often, and I don't want to just go with stereotypes, but often some of us here in North America, in the United States and in Canada, we see Europe as a vacation place, and some of our young people go to backpack for a year across Europe. Why should the North American church be concerned about sharing the gospel in Europe?
Let me be pragmatic as this answer. If I'm the pastor of a North American church, or maybe I'm the chair of the missions committee or whatever it is, and we've got resources, we've got people, we've got time, we've got money, we've got prayer capacity, we pragmatically spend that where we feel called to. We feel called to certain projects, certain people groups, certain places, and rightly so, we follow that lead from the Lord and invest for impact. I would like to argue that Europe is the most needy continent in the world. I went on mission trips to Africa for years, and they were wonderful and life-changing for me. I've done masses of work in Brazil over the years, and they've been wonderful for me. But I would argue that from a tipping point kind of argument, the global south, if we dare call it that, Africa and Asia and South America, is at a place where it can reach itself. The Chile's on fire. It doesn't need new missionaries in that sense. Now, there's other things we can do. There's compassion ministries, there's enabling and equipping ministries. But from a pure gospel sharing opportunity, I argue that Europe needs it more than anywhere else. And I'm arguing that to church leaders and mission pastors every day. Come and have a look. See if you catch what I catch. And they do. And they come on mission trips, and they send people, and they come on vision trips as pastors and mission committees, and they see it, and they see the need, and they see the opportunity, and they dive in.
Well, it's helpful to get your view on it because we're far away, and to have someone sharing with us that's on the ground, seeing it traveling across Europe, very helpful. In just a few moments, we'll ask Jon to share some of the ways that the North American church can participate in Europe, as well as sharing some practical resources and ideas for churches. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Ignite your passion for the world. The Jaffrey Center is made up of people like you and me who want to engage the world around them in new and meaningful ways. Through collaborative project development, training, and research projects, the Jaffrey Center seeks to rekindle and ignite a passion for God's unending concern for people. To learn more about us, visit jaffreyglobal.com. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Jon Burns of Greater Europe Mission. Jon, you were just sharing a little bit about your vision and heart for the needs in Europe and talking about interacting with the North American church. What are some of the opportunities that you see fit well for fellow Westerners, North Americans, potentially to share in reaching Europe?
Yeah, we're always asking people to join us in prayer, and through our website, people can easily connect with us to pray. And we feed that prayer with a daily text of different needs in different places in the world. We, for all our best efforts, if we don't get on our knees, there's no hope really for Europe. So most of anything, we encourage people to join us in prayer. We also encourage people to come and have a look. And they can come and have a look in all kinds of ways. We do vision trips for church leaders and mission pastors and mission committee members. We do vision trips for those considering becoming a missionary and joining us. And one of the hottest things for us at the moment is mission teams. We have mission teams, about 1,000 people on mission teams, probably about 80 teams last year, coming and doing a week or 10 days in various cities and various opportunities and types of ministry across Europe. Everything from a building project to a street evangelism project and everything in between. And one of the most exciting things that we've stumbled on the last couple of years is we're inviting 18 to 25-year-olds from churches to come on a program that we call 10-2, obviously based on Luke 10:2 and the cry for more workers into the harvest. And it's a 10-week program. People come and they get a week's training in the French Alps in one of the accommodation blocks we've got there. And then they're split into teams of 10 into 10 cities across Europe for 8 weeks of ministry. And then they come back together as a remobilization where we look at some Christian history in Europe and end up at our annual conference with 500 missionaries that they can be a part of and see if they have a calling and a future to it. So people can engage in all kinds of ways: short-term trips, intern experiences, vision trips for church leaders and mission committees. And all of that can really be easily accessed through our website.
Sure. Just give us a word about language. Many of us in North America, our first language and most comfortable is English, of course. Does that work in Europe, in some places in Europe? I'm sure it varies, but just give us a bit of a picture of language.
Yeah, we're really committed to heart language. So if somebody joins us a missionary and is going for, a few years to a place, we're really very disciplined on them going through the process of learning language. And a lot of people do that in the nations they're going to be working in. They go and serve, they join a team, and it might be half their time in the first year or two is in language school. But for those coming on short-term trips, we don't worry about it. We love it if someone has a language and we can, there's no point someone coming on an internship with great French and we put them in Frankfurt. But so we try and point people to where they can be useful. But the truth is, for a lot of youth ministry and a lot of street ministry, loads of Europe speaks English. You can get away with it on a short-term trip in English, as you can as a tourist getting around Europe. But for those that are going long-term, we're very committed to language learning.
On another episode, we've talked about the global youth culture and seeing how, because we're so connected by the internet now, that many young people, especially you mentioned that, young people are watching the same YouTube channels, they're listening to the same music, they're watching the same videos. And so it does create a sense of commonality that allows us to engage there for short term.
Yeah, well, then you've got places like Holland where they've just turned all their universities into English only. So, you can go and serve in Amsterdam and everybody in university is learning in English because their English standard is so good, as it is in Germany. French, they aren't as good at English necessarily, and the Spanish aren't so good, but Portugal's excellent, and lots of Greece is excellent. So there are places for those that are doing a short-term trip that is quite easy to work. And certainly on projects like our short-term teams or our intern programs, we put people where they're going to be able to actually make a difference, even in just in English. And the other thing to say on that, if I could, is increasingly we're sending missionaries to England so that they get almost a first step of mission in a culture where they can actually make a difference quite quickly, and then some bounce into wider Europe from England after 2 or 3 years. So we're treating England as a very bounce opportunity for missionaries as well.
Okay. Interesting. Kind of the first step into Europe. I'd like to just ask you about the other side too. What are some of the barriers or the cautions that we've learned about in bringing North Americans to Europe?
Oh, yeah, that is a minefield. Actually, funnily enough, we found that the biggest gap we've missed is those coming to England, because we assume that the culture is so similar that there won't be the mind the gap culture problems, right? And, we think the language is therefore easy and therefore the culture will be. And actually, in the past, we didn't help our people coming to England do as much cultural readjustment as we did those going to another country. And we've had to watch that because there is still a culture gap. And the culture gap can be, we train our people, obviously, to go for the long term and those for the short term, not to make the obvious faux pas culturally. We don't go to spread Americanism, obviously. We go to spread the gospel. And we've got to help people understand what is the gospel and what is their own culture. How do they take their own cultural specs off so they don't judge culture, but actually they try and engage with culture that others may hear the gospel. So we, like loads of mission agencies, we've all got good at this cross-cultural preparation and training. And we even do that with those coming for a short-term trip.
Mm-hmm. Well, helpful to note that just because we speak the same language doesn't mean we do need to take care to make sure that we're culturally sensitive, even though the language is very similar.
Well, Mags, I wish someone had told me this when I moved to Dallas 4 years ago, because I made the same backward assumption. Got to America. I've been to America 20 times, thought it'd be easy. I had a terrible first 6 months tripping over myself and everybody around me. So yeah, that culture gap works both ways, of course.
Jon, I wonder if there are missions committees listening, folks who are serving in their churches who would like to help their church engage in reaching Europe. What are some of the first steps they should take?
I think connect with us on the website, hear some of our stories, watch some of our videos, see how the Lord captures your heart, and then reach out to us. You can reach out to us through the website, and we've got a kind of church partnership group that works within GEM that'll give you a call, mostly people that have been involved in church leadership, and they'll say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want a short-term trip? Would you like to come on a vision trip? If there's a group of you, we'll tailor-make a trip for a place you might want to look at. If it's just 1 or 2 people, we have regular trips going. Can we encourage you to try one of our kind of focus cities that we're particularly pushing into? And then we'll just invite people on the journey with us and hold a hand as we have a look. And it might be that a church already knows the kind of place or project or people group that they're interested in. Or lots of churches come to us and go, Europe's on our heart. Where could we help you most? And we go, oh, thank you. Can we take you to 2 or 3 cities, see where you connect, show you 2 or 3 types of ministry, see what's right for your church? Obviously, one size doesn't fit all. So it's a relationship, really. We start a relationship with the church, take them on a journey, and see how we can help them shape their mission footprint.
In a minute, I'm going to ask Jon about resources that he would recommend for individuals or churches who want to learn more about Europe. But I just want to say I had a chance to visit the GEM website in preparation for this interview, and there are some particularly helpful resources for praying for Europe. And so as a first step, if the Lord is leading you to join this organization in praying over Europe, some specific countries, some specific cities, very strategic cities Jon, you mentioned Frankfurt as one of those strategic places you can join in the Lord's work in prayer. Some really excellent things there. Other resources, Jon, that you might recommend to our listeners?
I've struggled with this a little bit because there isn't a lot of great writing going on about mission in Europe right now. I think everyone's so busy with what the Lord's doing suddenly. We're all pausing a little bit on it. We put a book out about a year ago that one of our staff wrote called Worth the Risk. And that's a really good read about how we started as GEM. But it's all set in the context of a girl that was in the Paris bombings, one of our missionaries, and how she had to re-engage with the culture that she'd suddenly become frightened of. And that's a really heartwarming read. There's another book out there at the moment called Messiology by George Verwer. Lots of you will have heard of George Verwer. I think Messiology really well sums up the kind of context that we're finding ourselves in right now. We're actually going to start a new kind of fact sheet for mission pastors where we realize there's not a lot of current resources about what's God doing right now, articles on philosophy and theology around the stuff we're experiencing. And so we're going to start our own one of them quite soon. If you want to reach out to us, we can make sure you're added to that list.
Okay. Well, I've got one last question in a moment, but if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you, follow up and learn more about Europe, you've mentioned the website. How can they reach out to you, Jon, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, our website's very simple. It's gemission.org. And there's loads of ways you can connect through there. But if you want to write to me personally, you can do that through there. And my email address is jon.burns. I'm no H in Jon, I'm a Jonathan. jon.burns@gemission.org. I'm very happy to connect with people. And certainly those that want to engage from a church point of view, I'd love to introduce you to some of our strategic partner church group that would happily walk you through a journey into Europe.
Super. Thank you. Well, here I'd like to close with this question. If you had the opportunity, Jon, to stand in front of a missions committee of a local church, a group of people who really wants to do missions well, wants to be engaged in God's purposes in these days, what would you say to that group?
I'm increasingly concerned that the church in the West, and I include my own England in this, only thinks of mission with one pedal, like a pedal on a bicycle. And mission has to be local and it has to be global. And my guess is there are churches listening to this that have become very good at local mission and may have forgotten about global mission. Equally, there might be churches listening who are great at global mission. I'd want to encourage you to push into your own community. And so if as a church, we recognize our call to mission has two pedals, it's local and it's global, it's round the corner and it's round the world. On the round the world piece, I'd ask you to consider Europe. I know that historically, lots of us have had wonderful mission relationships into South America, into Africa, into Asia. And I certainly don't want to stop you doing those things. But I just would like to ask you, have you forgotten Europe? Is there more need in Europe than you perhaps realize spiritually? Is there perhaps a new opportunity for you to consider Europe for part of your mission footprint?
Well, a great word from Jon to have us balance local and global, and to make sure that we continue to consider Europe as one of those places that needs mission workers. Jon, thanks so much for spending this time with us today and sharing with us some of your heart for Europe and some of the need in Europe. And may the Lord bless you as you lead Greater Europe Mission and use you for his purposes there.
Thank you so much, Mags. I've really enjoyed it.
I appreciated today hearing from Jon about the continuing need for workers to go to post-Christian Europe. GEM is a trustworthy organization, so if you feel the Lord leading you or your church to this part of the world, we would certainly encourage you to include them in the conversation. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.